MEST Tactics, Introductory Mission 1, A Duel in the Pit. A simple fight between two characters. Use simple actions minus range combat. The battlefield will be 24 by 24 units. I used cake decorations, but you can use Coke cans or just boxes. Arrange the battlefield in a 4x4 array with columns 4 units apart. The two characters will be Cain and Abel. They'll both be average characters, and they'll be equipped with improvised melee weapons. This will be 30 build points plus 0 for the improvised melee weapon. The average characters are just 2 in every attribute to make things easy, and then size is essentially just 3. It means it can take 3 wounds before it gets knocked out or KO'd. See the improvised melee weapon. Essentially, it's just stub, one-handed, and it has just strength for the amount of damage it causes. For the models, you can just use 2 tokens or 2 random figures. Alright, on the left is a modified HeroClix figure in blue. On the right is just some cobblestone figure. It's Pirate the Club. So you can see the 2 figures here. Their averages, stat lines are all 2 except for size, which is 3. They're both worth 30 points. Here are the victory conditions. 1 VP for crossing the midline of the battlefield between the 2 starting edges, so that red line right there. 1 VP for wounding the opponent first. Another VP for a flawless victory, having the least VP KO'd or eliminated. Determine the mission attacker by rolling dice and the highest wins. Abel becomes mission attacker and decides that Cain should deploy first. Place a turn indicator on the mission attacker side of the battlefield. Each player receives 2 base dice and picks a model to be the designated leader. It is an opposed test comparing the INT scores of both models. The winner of the initiative has the highest test score and receives 1 initiative point per cascade. Cain goes first and receives 2 action points. Each action point spent allows it to move 4 units. This is its MOV score plus 2. Cain did not cross the midline and uses rushing to acquire 1 more action point. As a result, it becomes distracted with the delay token. It finishes with a move and then marked as done. Cain decides to remove its delay token by spending 1 of its initiative points. This is allowed once per initiative. Abel receives the initiative, becomes the active character, and receives 2 action points. Again, it moves. Each time it moves for 1 action point, it can move 4 units. Abel considers using the imprecision rule and to make base contact, but decides against that and is marked done instead. All models are done, so therefore it is now turn 2. Remove all done tokens. Another initiative test. Each player receives their 2 base dice. Again, this is an opposed INT test. Highest score receives the cascades in initiative points. Cain wins with 2 initiative points. Cain becomes the active model with the initiative and decides to spend the first one to move into base contact. Facing does not matter. For a second action point, Cain decides to perform a close combat attack. There are 2 tests. The first is the close combat hit test. Each player receives their 2 base dice and adds their CCA score for their model. When the hit test is passed, the damage test comes next. There are no carryovers this test. For the close combat damage test, each player receives their 2 base dice. Usually an attacker's weapon provides additional dice, but in this case, it's improvised melee, so there's none. When the attacker passes the damage test, the target receives 1 wound for every cascade. Once per turn, if a model receives wounds, it must perform a fear test. This is an unopposed test. The active player is the target, and the system player is the opposing player. The system player receives a modifier die because the wounded character has 1 hindrance type. In case of ties, the active player, the target, wins. So there is no result for the fear test. Kane decides to use rushing and receive one more action point to perform a second attack. Kane acquires a delay token for rushing and then another delay token for performing a second attack in the turn. Perform the close combat hit test. Each player gets their 2 base dice. Kane has a hindrance type, so Abel gets a modifier die. Abel has a hindrance type, so Kane gets a modifier die. And now we flatten. Kane fails a close combat hit test, so nothing happens. And now we mark Kane as done. As before, Kane spends an initiative point to remove one of its delay tokens, and only one per initiative. Abel is in base contact, so decides to perform a close combat attack. Every player gets 2 base dice and performs the close combat hit test. As before, each player gets a modifier die because the opposing model has 1 hindrance type, and then we flatten again. For its first action, Abel fails the close combat attack. For its second action point, Abel decides to try to do a disengage action. Each character gets their 2 base dice. Abel has 2 hindrance types, and Kane has 1 hindrance type. The character performing the disengage test acquires an extra base die. And now we flatten the dice. It will be the active character's RAF score against the opposing character's CCA score. As the active character, Abel wins the tie and may now reposition. This is not a move, it is a reposition. It may reposition up to its MOV score times 1. For educational purposes, it moves into base contact with a column. Abel decides to be marked as done. Both characters are now done. There is no more to do, so remove all initiative points. It's now turn 3, so change the indicator and remove all done tokens. Perform the initiative test. Each player gets their 2 base dice and adds the INT score of their designated leader models. Kane has 1 hindrance type, so Abel gets a modifier die. Abel has 2 hindrance types, so Kane gets a modifier die twice. And now we flatten the dice. Kane wins the initiative test and receives 1 initiative point as a cascade. However, Abel also has a carryover, so receives 1 initiative point per carryover die. Kane decides to go first and receives 2 action points. However, for every delay token it has, it must remove 1 action point. Kane now has 1 action point remaining. Kane decides to move into base contact. Kane uses rushing to receive 1 more action point and perform a close combat attack. Rushing causes Kane to acquire a delay token. Each player has their base dice and receive modifier dice because the opposing models have hindrances. Abel is cornered, so Kane receives another modifier die. And now we flatten the dice. Perform the close combat hit test by adding the CCA scores of both models. Kane wins the close combat hit test with 2 cascades. Because Cain passed the close combat hit test, now we perform the close combat damage test. Cain, as the active attacker, adds its strength value, STR, and Abel adds its FOR, or fortitude value, to the test score. Abel wins the test, and so no effect for Cain's attack. And so Cain is marked as done. Cain decides to remove its delay token by spending an initiative point. There is no facing in the game, but rotate Abel to make it look nice. Abel decides to perform a close combat attack. Each player gets their base dice, and Cain receives 2 modifier dice because Abel has 2 different hindrance types. Because Abel is cornered, Cain receives a 3rd modifier die. The close combat hit test will be an opposed CCA score. Abel succeeds with 1 cascade and 1 carryover. The carryover continues to the combat damage test, and so Abel would roll 3 base dice, 1 plus the 2 base dice it normally receives. Abel adds its STR score, and Cain adds its FOR score. Abel succeeds with 1 cascade, which causes Cain to receive 1 wound token. Cain must therefore perform a fear test, an opposed test against the system. That will be the opposing player. Therefore, each player gets 2 base dice. The system player, in this case Abel, receives 1 modifier die because Cain has 1 hindrance type. As the active character for the unopposed test, Cain wins with a tie, so no effect for the fear test. Abel has no more action points and is marked as done. Player decides to remove the delay token from Abel. This is done by paying an initiative point. There are no more ready models, so the turn indicator is increased by 1, and all done tokens are removed. At the end of this turn, the endgame triggers begin. Now we perform the initiative test again. Each model has a hindrance, so the opposing players receive 1 modifier die each. As always, for every test we flatten the dice. This time Cain wins the initiative test with 2 cascades and receives 2 initiative points. Cain decides to perform a close combat attack. Each character receives their 2 base dice. Each model has a hindrance type, so the opposing players each receive 1 modifier die. Abel is cornered, so Cain receives an additional modifier die. And now we flatten the dice. Cain and Abel perform the close combat hit test by adding their CCA scores. As the active character, Cain wins the ties. And so now the close combat damage test is performed. Each player receives their 2 base dice. Cain adds its SCR score, and Abel adds its FOR score. Cain fails the close combat damage test, so nothing occurs. Cain has 1 action point left. Cain decides to go ahead and perform a second attack. As a result, it acquires a delay token. Now perform the close combat hit test and assign the modifier dice as before. This time, Abel gets 2 modifier dice. Cain gets 1 modifier dice for the 1 hindrance type that Abel has, and a second one because Abel is cornered. And now we flatten the dice. Cain passes the test with 1 cascade and 1 carryover. For the damage test, the carryover remains, and the player gets 2 of its normal base dice. Cain succeeds with 1 cascade. As a result, Abel receives another wound. A successful damage test always causes the target to acquire a minimum of 1 wound token. Cain has no more actions and so is marked as done. Player decides to spend an initiative point to remove its delay token on Cain. Abel chooses to perform a close combat attack. Each player receives their 2 base dice. Each player receives their modifier dice because the opposing model has 1 hindrance type. Abel is cornered, so Cain receives a second modifier die. Both players flatten their dice. For the close combat hit test, each character adds their CCA score. Abel fails the test. The player decides not to use rushing and marks Abel as done. So this is the end of turn 4, which is the beginning of the endgame. So an endgame trigger die is added. If the game continues to another turn, it would be rolled. So now it is turn 5 and all the done tokens are removed. And all remaining initiative point tokens are removed too. For the initiative test, each player receives their 2 base dice. Because each designated leader has 1 hindrance type, the players receive 1 modifier die apiece. And then we flatten the modifier dice. This is a tie. The mission attacker, in this case Abel, decides to re-roll the dice instead of just taking 0 initiative points. Another tie. After a 3rd attempt, Cain wins with 1 cascade and is awarded 1 initiative point. Cain decides to perform a close combat attack. Each player receives their 2 base dice and receive modifier dice because their opposing models have 1 hindrance type. As before, Abel is cornered, so Cain receives a second modifier die. Both players flatten their dice. As the active character, Cain wins any ties. And so the close combat hit test is passed, and now each player performs the close combat damage test. Cain fails the damage test, and so nothing happens. Cain decides to attack again, and so acquires a delay token. Each player receives their 2 base dice. Cain receives a modifier die because Abel has 1 hindrance type. Abel receives 2 modifier dice because of the 2 different hindrance types that Cain has. Finally, Abel is cornered, and so Cain receives a second modifier die. Each player flattens their dice. Cain fails the close combat hit test miserably, so nothing happens. It is marked as done. The player decides to remove the delay token by spending an initiative point. Abel decides to perform a close combat attack. Each player receives their 2 base dice. Each player receives a modifier die because the other character has 1 hindrance type. And Cain receives another modifier die because Abel is cornered. And now we flatten the dice. This time, Abel succeeds with 3 cascades and 2 carryover dice. Onward to the damage test. The 2 carryover dice remain, and 2 additional base dice are added for both players. Abel will add its STR attribute, and Cain will add its FOR attribute. Abel scores 3 cascades against Cain, and so Cain replaces its 1 wound with 3 wounds. Cain is size 3. 3 wounds matches or exceeds size 3, and so Cain is KO'd. So mission 1 is done, and let's see how it scores. Apparently it's a tie.